Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee to order. Today, the subcommittee will hear from the service vice chiefs regarding the state of military readiness and how the fiscal 2020 operation and maintenance budgets requested support the military training, weapon systems maintenance, and efforts to meet full spectrum readiness, and the requirements in aligning to the National Defense Strategy. This year, the subcommittee has held events covering a range of topics, including quarterly readiness report, the mobility and logistics enterprises, the impacts of climate change on national security, military family housing, surface Navy readiness, and the budget request for military installations. Those briefings and hearings have touched on important issues that affect the military readiness, but I think it's appropriate that we have witnesses here today to help inform us on the readiness challenges their individual services face, and the initiatives that they have in place to mitigate those challenges, and finally, how the 2020 budget request meets those efforts and supports those efforts. For the past several years, we've heard the services raise concerns about the state of the military's full spectrum readiness after more than a decade of focusing on counterterrorism and counterinsurgency missions. With a 2-year budget agreement in place and additional resources available to the department, the fiscal 2018 was touted as the year to arrest the decline of readiness. And fiscal year 2019 would begin the readiness recovery. Is it so? Well, that's a question I'm sure our witnesses would want to answer. I hope that today the witnesses can discuss how these additional resources have been executed by the department and where we have seen readiness and progress in readiness and areas that still may require additional attention. As we look to the 2020 budget request, which represents a significant increase in defense spending, I'm concerned that the department is once again overly focused on the long-term readiness, that's someday out in the future, through their various modernization programs, and is not placing enough emphasis investing in the near term, that is, next year and this year, to support the training and sustainment of the existing weapon systems and the personnel. For example, the budget request only addresses 94% of the Navy ship depot maintenance requirement and 90% of the Air Force weapon system sustainment and 82% of the Marine Corps ground depot maintenance. I hope that today our witnesses can explain how their respective services view the balance between sustainment and modernization, and how this budget request will affect the near-term readiness as their efforts go forward. Relating to the budget request, there are a number of programs and areas that have caught our subcommittee's attention that impact the readiness of the force. For example, the GAO has found that since 2015, nearly 64% of the public and private shipyard availabilities either have been or are expected to be behind schedule. That obviously affects the Navy and Marine Corps training and readiness. The aviation community has shortfalls in pilot and maintenance personnel, mission capability rates below standards, and the number of challenges with the operation and sustainment of that famous F-35 fleet. The continued demand on Army forces, combined with the lack of sufficient time for home station training and proper equipment maintenance, challenge its readiness recoveries. And did I forget to mention border? I think I did. And, of course, climate change presents a myriad of readiness challenges both at home and abroad. It's not only a future threat, but it's impacting the resiliency of our installations and operations today, as we have seen all too sadly at the Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune and Tyndall Air Force Base and Offutt Air Force Base. I hope that, gentlemen, you will address how you view these issues and the actions you're taking or plan to take in an effort to address them. Finally, I hope that you will talk about areas where you are pursuing innovation as a means to improve the delivery of readiness. For example, things like condition-based maintenance plus, the adoption of commercial and industrial best practices in supply chain management, additive manufacturing, and the use of live virtual constructive training. We're interested in how these innovations can improve efficiency, reduce costs, while supporting a more ready and capable force. Mr. Lambourne, it's your turn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is fitting that the Readiness Subcommittee's final budget review hearing before markup is on the vital topic of military readiness. In short, are the operational units of the military services prepared to execute their combat missions when asked? Put another way, are the armed forces of the United States prepared to fulfill their constitutional duty to provide for the common defense? Although a simple question, building effective military units is an extraordinarily complex task requiring time, skilled personnel, resources, and maneuver area. I'm glad that senior military leaders are here to provide us their candid assessment of the state of their respective services. I welcome our witnesses, the 4 military service vice chiefs, and note that General McConville has been nominated to be the Army's Chief of Staff, and Admiral Moran has been nominated to be Chief of Naval Operations. I wish you both speedy confirmation in the other body. Too bad we don't have any say in that. We all recognize that readiness suffered during several years of underfunding following the 2011 enactment of the Budget Control Act, as well as constant use of the armed forces for a multitude of missions. 2 years ago, the situation began to improve, starting with an infusion of funds in the spring of 2017, followed by healthy appropriations for fiscal years 2018 and 2019. All of us would like to understand how this steady funding has improved readiness with specific examples. What remains to be done, and what would be the consequences if we fail to support the level of funding requested in this year's request? We recognize that readiness is built piece by piece until a commander is convinced his or her unit has the people, equipment, and training repetitions necessary to perform the mission assigned. Naturally, our discussion today will concentrate on specific parts of that equation. Do we have enough pilots, parts, ammunition, and so on? It's important to understand in detail how the money provided has been expended and how it contributes to readiness. And that's what I'll be looking for from each of your presentations. As we have those discussions, I ask our witnesses and colleagues to keep the big picture in mind. What overall funding, what top-line number must we maintain to ensure that our troops are trained and ready when called upon? What do we do as a Congress to provide for the common defense? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. We'll now turn to our witnesses, and as I do, I want to follow on the introductions and the comments that you made, Mr. Lamborn. We have before us a couple of gentlemen who are, assuming the Senate agrees, going to take new jobs. General McConville, congratulations on your appointment and passage of the Senate hearing. And Admiral Moran, the same. Both of you will, I suspect, very shortly have new jobs as Chief of Staff and Chief of Naval Operations. General Thomas, we thank you for joining us. I'm quite sure that someday we'll also carry on as I just did. But at the moment, welcome. Thank you so very much. And General Wilson, thank you for joining us. As Vice Chiefs and Assistant Commandant in the Marine Corps and Vice Chief, we welcome you. Now, let's have at your testimony. Let's start with General McConville.
Well, good afternoon, Chairman Governmendi, Ranking Member Lamborn, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and also for your continued support of our Army, our soldiers, families, and civilians. The Army remains ready to fight and win our nation's war. Currently, we have nearly 180,000 soldiers in 140 countries around the world defending our nation's freedom. Timely, adequate, predictable, and sustained funding over the last 2 years from all of you has significantly increased the number of our brigade combat teams at the highest levels. Our non-deployables have dropped from 15% in 2015 to 6% today. In training, we have improved our unit readiness and lethality by fully funding our home station training and combat training center rotations. We are increasing our soldiers' readiness with a new Army combat fitness test and by embedding physical therapists, strength coaches, dietitians, and occupational therapists within our units. In line with the National Defense Strategy, we have shifted our focus from irregular warfare to great power competition. And while we've been focused on irregular warfare, Our competitors have been innovating and investing in sophisticated anti-access and aerial denial systems, enhanced missile systems, and unmanned capabilities. To maintain overmatch, we must modernize the Army. Our modernization efforts include developing the multi-domains operations concept echelon, executing our 6 modernization priorities, and implementing a 21st century talent management system. The Army has established the Army's Futures Command and has prioritized resources for our 6 modernization priorities, which will enable us to grow Army readiness for the future. Army's Futures Command and cross-functional teams will continue to produce rapid and innovative solutions to make our soldiers the most lethal war fighters on the battlefield. Soldiers are our greatest strength and most important weapon system. We will continue the modest growth of the Army, and our focus will be on recruiting and retaining high-quality soldiers. We are implementing a 21st century talent management system which will transform our personnel management process from the industrial age to the information age. The system will maximize talent within the force and preserve our ability to recruit and retain soldiers who are ready to meet any challenges now and in the future. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your support of our men and women in uniform. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. Admiral Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Lamborn, distinguished members of the committee, for the opportunity to appear before you to testify about our great sailors that are employed all over the globe today. Today we have over 65,000 young men and women serving on ships at sea and in foreign lands across many parts of the world, conducting everything from freedom of navigation operations in the Pacific to planning and delivering combat operations in the Middle East, supporting NATO allies in parts of the world like the Mediterranean, the Baltic, and Black Seas, and building closer partnerships with whoever is willing to partner with us around the globe. Your Navy is confidently meeting these challenges while preparing for those of tomorrow. However, as this committee understands, the armed forces have maintained a high operational tempo over the last 18 years. And while the demand for combat-ready naval forces has remained high, a substantial backlog in maintenance and modernization has accrued. Thanks to your continuing support over the past 2 years by providing stable and predictable funding, we've arrested that decline in readiness, but we've also found ourselves on a steady path to recovery in the last year. But this recovery is fragile and it's perishable, and your continued support is vital to our success. The President's FY20 budget request sustains our commitments to readiness, and it reflects a balanced approach to investments in people, procurement, modernization, and infrastructure. It provides your sailors with more time at sea, more time in the air, and more depth on the bench. Everything from ammunition to spare parts to training, and as important is proficiency at the jobs they've been asked to do. With past as a prologue, if we revert back to more continuing resolutions or go as far as sequestration, the burden will be carried once again on the backs of our men and women, both uniformed and civilian, as well as our depot workers in public and private yards throughout the country. As you know, today's all-volunteer force is a rich blend of the finest young men and women this country has to offer. Supported by their dedicated families, they're working hard to achieve improved readiness for a world that is more complex, more contested than we have seen in many decades. And our sailors are keenly aware of their essential place at this strategic inflection point. They understand that increased naval strength matters now and far into the future in order to sustain our way of life and the prosperity and security of America. It's on their behalf that I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral. General Thomas.
Chairman Garamendi, Ranking Member Lamborn, and distinguished members of this subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. The Marine Corps is manned, trained, and equipped to be the world's premier naval expeditionary force. We're ready to respond to crisis and conflict across the full range of military operations in every clime and place. As a member of the Navy and Marine Corps team, we stand together as part of the contact and layers in the global operating model, forward deployed to deter our adversaries and able to fight and win should deterrence fail. To maintain this capability, the Marine Corps requires sustained, adequate, and predictable funding to achieve required readiness levels and make prudent investments in preparation for the future operating environment. The support of Congress over the past 2 years has played a key role in allowing the Marine Corps to make significant gains in readiness and move towards the modernization of the force. As we approach FY20, your continued support remains critical. Over the last year, Hurricane Florence and Michael caused massive damage to our facilities at Camp Lejeune and other places. The effects of these storms will impact Marine Corps readiness for years to come due to the financial burden of $3.7 billion in damages. We greatly appreciate Congress approving our $400 million reprogramming request, allowing us to begin addressing our most pressing infrastructure requirements. Despite these concerns, your Marines will continue to maximize the precious resources that have been entrusted to us. With your assistance, we will ensure that the Marine Corps is a ready, modern force that is prepared for a changing strategic environment. I look forward to answering your questions.
Chairman Garamendi, Ranking Member Lambourne, distinguished members of this committee, it's an honor to be appearing before you with my joint teammates here today. With my prepared statement in the record, let me briefly summarize a few things. First and foremost, thank you for your help. Without it, we would not have been able to move the ball forward, and we have. We can continue to build a more lethal and ready force while fueling tomorrow's Air Force faster and smarter. Air Force-wide readiness is up 17%. Our pacing unit readiness is up 33%. 90% of our lead force packages are ready to fight tonight. All of that was made possible by your support. Unfortunately, the weather was not supportive. We've had devastating impacts at Tyndall Air Force Base and at Offutt Air Force Base. At Tyndall Air Force Base alone, $4.7 billion of damage. 95% of the facilities were either destroyed or damaged. We've covered those costs within our accounts to date, but that is not supportable. As a result, we're asking for your help. You're our insurance policy for natural disasters. We need additional disaster relief support, and we also need to continue with fiscal order. Without it, 2 years of steady progress will erode. We can prevent that and protect America's vital national interests, but again, we need stable, adequate, and predictable funding. I urge us to not self-select second place. I know nobody in that room wants that. Together, we can come together and find a way forward. Thank you for your continued support of all of our airmen and their families. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Wilson, and for request unanimous consent of the committee to put the written statements of the gentleman in the record. Without objection, so ordered. We'll now go to questions, and I'll lead off here, followed by Mr. Lambourne, then, as is the normal, 5 minutes back and forth across the divide here. There is no divide. In my opening statement, I expressed concerns about how you are balancing the planning and programming of modernization, which supports long-term readiness at the expense of funding, sustainment, maintenance, and training that in the near term. Each of your O&M budget requests appear, by the numbers, to underinvest in sustainment when compared to the identified requirement. Please discuss how this apparent discrepancy is dealt with. We'll begin in the same order. Mr. General McConville.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and our Secretary-in-Chief have determined our number one priority is readiness. And we have a good historical example of last year where we had timely, adequate, predictable, and sustainable funding. We saw a great improvement in our overall readiness. And this year, the budget that we asked for is the budget we need. We have an 8% increase in aviation, a 3% increase in ground, and a 3% increase in what we're applying to depots. And we're going to take a look to make sure that's the right amount as we go through the year. We will assess that. If we don't have that correct, we will make adjustments.
Admiral?
Mr. Chairman, a very similar response from the Navy. We too program to what we think is max executable, so that include, while the requirement may be very high, the capacity and capability to achieve that full requirement on a given year is often in question. It depends on how much backlog has occurred, especially in ship depot maintenance and issues like that. So we have funded it at the highest levels we have in my memory, and that's due to the support we've received from Congress and the President in his budget request. So we're on a good trajectory, and we'll assess it early in the year, and if we need to make adjustments at mid-year, we will.
General Thomas?
Chairman, we believe that we have a reasonable balance in terms of investments vis-a-vis modernization and readiness. One of the things that we do is, as all of our teammates do, is we balance risk across the entire portfolio. But the measures that we look at is how we're doing in terms of readiness. And as we make those risk decisions, and all of our readiness metrics are up. We have specific service goals that we are striving for, and we anticipate to meet all those goals in FY20.
General Wilson?
Chairman, just like my teammates here, it's much the same story as we balance both modernization and readiness. First and foremost, we think readiness is about people, and we've grown the force 24,500 people since 2015. But it's more than just the people. It's also the equipment, the training, the support infrastructure, the parts, the depots, and we think we have the right balance going forward between near-term readiness and long-term readiness because, as you've said, today's readiness is tomorrow's modernization, and we've got to get that right in the balance.
All of you produce a quarterly report, and as I recall, that quarterly report has certain goals and objectives. Is that correct? So I hear all of you say, nodding your head, yes. When's the next quarterly report for the current fiscal year due? Do we call that? Well, I raised the question because we're going to observe your quarterly reports. We're going to observe the every quarter the goals that you have set, the objectives that you have set, and should you be falling short in some area, we will observe it, but we would like to know ahead of time so that if there's a need for reprogramming or some change along the way, we can work together to achieve it. We are intensely interested in your success, and you should recognize that our interest is one of cooperation or whatever else might be necessary, okay? Admiral Moran, you have an unfunded priority request for additional funding for submarine and ship maintenance. The USS Boise, the city thereof, has been an issue for quite some time. Can you discuss why we are now seeing it in your unfunded list as opposed to it's in the budget request specifically?
Sir, in my opening, I discussed the accrual of ship maintenance over the last decade, and we have begun to dig our way out of that in both public and private yards. One of the more challenging areas of this recovery path, though, has been in our nuclear maintenance, both public and private. And our prioritization in going after that maintenance is for our SSBN force, for all the reasons you can imagine, followed by our nuclear aircraft carriers, and the third priority is our SSN force. Mixed into all that are what we call moored training ships or submarines. There's two of those that replace our prototype capabilities in Charleston and in New York. They have taken priority. So this is a symptom of those prioritizations kicking the next guy down in order. And Boise, unfortunately, has been at the tail end of that for the last 4 years. And we are short again in this current budget environment on depot maintenance and capacity in the yards to be able to take Boise in. So we've deferred her until 2020, and we hope to start her at the very beginning of the fiscal year.
We've had a discussion about the yards and the $21 billion over the next 6-7 years
21 over 20, yes, sir.
21 over 20 to redesign and repurpose those yards. Again, we would expect to be updated on a semi-annual basis on the success that you're having in that process. Also, the plans. We've had that discussion last year. We want to go back and review it again as those plans have been updated with regard to the yards. We recognize that there is a problem in the capacity and also the balance between the public and the private yards and how you propose to balance availability in private yards that may have come in the recent days available, for example, the Philly yard. Sure. So if you'll keep that in mind. I think many of the other questions, I'm going to defer them and we'll come back on maybe a second round of questions along the way. Mr. Lamborn, if you'd like to take it up.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to have a specific question for General Wilson and then a general question for everybody on what would be the effects on readiness if you don't get the funding that you've asked for. General Wilson, we know that the department intends to create a Space Force/Space Corps within the Department of the Air Force. How is that effort progressing, and what do you need from Congress to help?
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. The Air Force has been committed to the Space Force. We know, and our adversaries know, we're the best in the world at space, and we're committed to that. So over this last year, we've been working hard to grow our warfighting aspects of the Space Force in terms of the training and the development of the people who make that up. We're also committed to standing up a United States Space Command. We've nominated General J. Raymond to be the commander of that and are anxious to put that forward as a combatant command.
An excellent choice.
He's a fantastic airman, and no one more capable to lead that new command. We're also working to look at the steps and where that headquarters would be. And we're working with Congress on the legislative proposal to stand up the new independent Space Force, which will be underneath the United States Air Force. We think we've got a team working inside the Pentagon with all the sister services to build that Space Force, and we think that's important moving forward for the future.
Okay, thank you. And we stand by ready to help however we can on that effort. Now, for each one of you, the years following enactment of the Budget Control Act had a detrimental effect on readiness. What are the consequences on readiness if the proposed levels of funding in your budget request are not maintained? And we'll just go down the line here. General McConville.
Yes, Congressman, and from the levels, what we ask for is what we need. If we went back to a sequestration type level, it would be absolutely devastating. All the readiness gains we made would be lost. We would not be able to modernize the Army. We'd have to reduce the end strength, and we would hurt the quality of life for all our soldiers.
Sir, I would completely agree that going back to sequester levels next year would be devastating on the force. Certainly, the money and investment we've made in our yards and our depots, hiring people, ship workers, welders, artisans who take 5 years to build that skill and before they're proficient and effective in many cases, you lose all that because the yards are going to have to, private yards in many of your districts are going to have to be laid off. They're going to have to lay off workers to be able to balance the difference with canceled avails. We're talking on the order of 10 to 15 avails that would have to be canceled or deferred. That's important work. And again, that backlog of maintenance I talked about that took 10 years to get there, and the last 4 or 5 years of working really hard to bring that back, we're going to revert back to where we were. So that, and of course, naval aviation and our improvements in readiness in the aviation force has really come hitting stride here in the last year, and that's due in large part to the added funding and stable funding that you all have provided. So going to sequester levels, we're going to have to make hard choices about the number of people we bring on, the number of deployments we do or don't do, and the kind of maintenance we're going to be able to get done. Thank you.
Congressman, I would echo the comments of my teammates. I would just emphasize from a Marine Corps perspective, the readiness gains that we've made over the past 2 years, a fairly rapid reversal of those gains. We've talked about the balance between readiness and modernization, but it would also slow our modernization efforts. Some of our key pieces of equipment are 30 or 40 years old, and we have a plan to address those, but any significant reduction in funding would significantly slow those efforts. And then finally, our efforts to respond to our hurricane recovery would be greatly hampered. We would attend to those most immediate needs. That, of course, would even further exacerbate some of the other funds that we would use for training, maintenance of equipment, et cetera.
Congressman, the military has been engaged almost continuously for almost the last 30 years. No adversary can do to us what fiscal disorder could do to us. Going back to budget level, but BCA caps and sequestration level would devastate the United States Air Force. As a point, in fact, when we went to sequestration in 2013, we had to find about $7.5 billion. If we went to sequestration levels again, it would be 4 times that. That's the equivalent. We would stop flying for the United States Air Force for the year, and that would only cover a partial piece of that. We would shut down all the modernization programs, and we would erase every bit of the gains that we've had in the last 2 years. So I think all of our teammates here would agree that the most important thing is a predictable, adequate, stable budget moving forward.
So it sounds like it wouldn't just be devastating to our men and women in uniform, but it would send a horrible signal to potential adversaries that they could make trouble and we would be in a lesser of a position to respond. It would be destabilizing. Is that your assessment?
Yes, it would be.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. We're now going to follow the rules and the order. We're going to go back to the clock. It'll be 5 minutes in total, both Q&A. And so, gentlemen, if you'll keep that in mind, and I don't need to remind my colleagues here. Let's see, we have Ms. Torres Small. You get to start us off.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General McConville, congratulations on your new post and my very best of luck as Chief of Staff. My first question is for you. New Mexico's 2nd Congressional District, which I represent, is home to the Army's White Sands Missile Range and Test Facility, which is the largest military installation in the United States, and it allows the Department of Defense and allied partners to do open-air testing, research, evaluation, and training. From a testing perspective, can you discuss the current and future strategies the Army is implementing to keep testing costs competitive at White Sands Missile Range?
Yes, I can, Congresswoman. As you said, White Sands is a tremendous testing area. It's a huge facility, and we're investing in that right now. We've got to put some new radars in, some new telemetry-type systems. The Army's #1 priority is long-range precision fires, so we're going to be doing things that have much longer range with future vertical lift, and we need a place to adequately test them, and we also need to adjust our systems so we can do the proper tests, and White Sands is going to be one of those places that we're going to use.
That's great. Also, what is the Army doing to attract more allied partners to test at White Sands?
Well, one of the things that we're doing with our partners, both in testing and really in foreign military sales, is one of the ways we can reduce costs, makes things cheaper, and keep the not only organic industrial base but the testing base going, is working with our partners. So we've kind of gone an effort to do that. We haven't done a whole bunch of that before, but we're starting to realize the value in doing those type things.
Great, thank you. The next question is for General Wilson. The New Mexico Air National Guard is the only guard in the country without an operational flying mission, and one of 3 states without its own aircraft. Yet the Air National Guard enterprise is based on established capstone principles that set the foundational framework for mission set application throughout the 54 states and territories. Specifically, one of these capstone principles is to allocate at least 1 unit-equipped wing and flying squadron to each state. General, you spoke about that readiness is about people, and I tell you that the people of the New Mexico Air National Guard are hungry for their own aircraft. Do you believe states that are currently able to align with these core principles due to divestiture of aircraft in the past impacts the readiness of the units and the Air Force?
Yeah, Congresswoman, obviously when the Taco Guard left New Mexico was a big impact. when it was felt. So we look to match the missions with the Guard units, and we're committed to working with you moving forward to find the right mission for New Mexico. I think our secretary was asked about that during testimony too, and she committed to that also. So we're going to continue to partner with you to make sure we got the right mission for the New Mexico Air National Guard moving forward.
Thank you, General Wilson. Should these states be given priority for these new mission opportunities?
Yes, ma'am. We're going to look to see, again, how do we match that best mission with the people there. And again, we probably some opportunities to look at some active partnerships with local active units and see where we can do that. But again, we're committed to working with you moving forward.
Thank you, General. This question is also for General McConville. The most recent estimate provided that provided to Congress indicates that Army support to the U.S. southern border operations will cost nearly $100 million in FY 2019 Army operations and maintenance funds. Now, each one of you spoke incredibly strongly about the importance of predictable, adequate funding. As these operations and the funding requirements were unplanned, can you please discuss any impacts to Army readiness?
Yes, Congresswoman. Right now we have 2,300 soldiers, Title X soldiers on the border, about 2,000 National Guard. That's about 4,300. I would say at the Army level, 1 million. I wouldn't say that's a huge impact on our readiness. And what we're trying to do to mitigate that is the soldiers that are going down to the borders are doing the tasks they would do most like in the military. So the engineers are doing engineer work. The aviators are actually flying their helicopters. The logisticians are doing resupply operation. We're also trying to limit the time they're down there, maybe 90 days, so they can get back to their military mission.
Thank you. Please also speak to the activities being deferred due to this reallocation.
Well, we really have not had any major exercises deployed as far as what those units were going to be used for. If you talk to some of the troops, they might have said they might want to train, but at the Army level, the units that we're sending to the border did not have another mission that they are being taken away or a major exercise like a combat training center rotation by executing the operations on the border.
Thank you. I yield my time.
Thank you. I now turn to Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Wilson, I received your letter. Appreciate you getting that to us in a timely manner about the action and impact update regarding the steps that you're having to take due to a lack of supplemental disaster bill storms that hit last year. If I'm correct, you stopped all new work at Tyndall Air Force Base effective the 1st of the month. That had to be stopped. Deferring any recovering efforts at Offutt will have to start in July. You also created a plan to eliminate more than 18,000 training flying hours that will start in a few months, all while attempting to maintain the current tempo overseas and potential future engagements overseas. What impact does the loss of 18,000 flying hours have on our readiness, our capabilities, and our morale in the Air Force?
And Congressman, you hit the nail on the head about the importance of additional disaster relief funding. So currently, as you mentioned, we stopped new work at Tyndall. On the 15th of May, we're going to stop some of our depot inputs, which again will have a long-term impact. In June, we'll have to start canceling some of our major exercises. In July, we'll stop new work at Offutt Air Force Base. And in September, we think we'll have to cut up to 18,000 flying hours. Any of that creates a big impact and will ripple through not just this year, but into future readiness. And that's why we've been so insistent upon additional disaster supplemental funding.
General, any time I've seen damage from a storm, the longer you take to clean that damage up, the worse it gets. The mold grows, the rot, the other things, it just gets worse, and it costs you more the longer you wait to repair it. And in some cases, some things that could be repaired had it been done in a timely manner now must be totally taken down and rebuilt at a...
Congressman, you're exactly right. So today, we've just now are moving people out of tents at Tyndall Air Force Base from a storm that happened in early October. realizing that we've had 4 Category 5 storms hit the United States in our recorded history. Right? And this was a direct impact to Tyndall and the surrounding community. If you go there and people have visited, it looks like a war zone. 95% of the facilities have been damaged or destroyed. Right? So we want to bring Tyndall back, and we want to bring Tyndall back as quickly as we can. And to do that, we're going to need additional disaster relief support.
It looks like a war zone where I live, too.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for us, it was our crops that were destroyed. And where I live, if the farmers aren't making money, nobody's making money. It is the tax base for the cities, the counties, the school systems, and the lack of disaster assistance, the lack of timeliness in it is going to lead, in many cases, to bankruptcies where that didn't have to happen. The gamesmanship up here has caused part of that. General Thomas, before I go to you, I do want to mention that to date, I do not believe the Office of Management Budget has submitted a request for disaster assistance for the storms of 2018. General Thomas, Camp Lejeune, if I'm not mistaken, 1/3 of the United States Marine Corps firepower operates out of Camp Lejeune. And how are things there?
Thank you, Congressman. It's an operational platform for the United States Marine Corps. It's one of our major facilities, as you described. The $3.7 billion in damage is easy to see. The chairman was down there. Appreciate the chairman and the ranking member taking a look at that. Just if I were to paint a picture, what you've got is 800 buildings that were severely damaged. Many of those buildings are old. They're decades old. We continue to operate in what I would consider a little bit of an expeditionary environment. I visited the tank battalion. I saw a young Marine sitting at a desk where the wall was open to the outside air. We have an air crew doing their mission planning, in the hangar, a place where they can guarantee it's dry. It's Marines do what you would expect Marine soldiers, sailors, and airmen to do. It's cleaned up. It's neat. But when it rains, all those buildings are covered in water. So it has a significant impact on us. And I think as we go forward without additional relief, what we're going to be forced to do is take some of those funds from our training, maintenance of equipment, and infrastructure elsewhere in the Corps to address the problem.
Mr. Chairman, my time's expired, but I do want to, the last hopeful report I saw was maybe by Memorial Day. This is ridiculous. I mean, it's not your fault. I would tell you that any additional assistance that you can give us in getting the public the information about the damage that's being done by Congress and the White House not getting a disaster relief bill done, I think would help you get this done sooner rather than later. And I think the difference in getting it done next week and getting it done at Memorial Day or after Memorial Day is huge. And so I appreciate your service. I have to step to another committee meeting, but I look forward to being part of the solution.
Mr. Scott, thank you. You are consistently banging this drum, and appropriately so. Mr. Lamborn and I did have the opportunity to visit both Cherry Point as well as Camp Lejeune. The members of the committee, it is my intention this month to visit Tyndall, and I would welcome any members of the committee that would want to join on that. Date to be determined. So we'll try to figure out when we might be able to accomplish that. I would just, I will forego the opportunity to make additional comments on this. I think the gentleman, and I think many of the team here is aware. I will point out that the House is now processing once again a emergency disaster appropriation bill. The Senate has not moved it. The House bill will be similar with some modifications, particularly dealing with the two issues that have been put forth here with Lejeune and Tyndall and Offutt and Cherry Point. That is in process, and perhaps that will cause the Senate to get a little more active or complete its task. I now turn to Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. My questions are, the first set of questions for General McConville have to do with the Chinook Block 2 upgrade, which is part of my community. I am just outside of Philadelphia, and I've asked other senior Army officers and leaders about this decision recently to pull back on the Block 2 upgrade in this coming fiscal year's budget. And I would like to have a three-part question for you today that has to do with the impact on that decision in terms of readiness. So if the Chinooks that are currently in service are not replaced with the Block 2s, as is the proposed solution right now, what is the plan for sustaining them in that fleet into the 2030s and 2040s? So that's my first question. Do you want me to give them one at a time, or would you prefer me to give them all together?
Congressman, whichever way you want, I can
So
go.
maybe it would be best to do it all at one time in case they fold into one another. And so should we expect to see increased funding for the Chinook sustainment in next year's budget and beyond, and reflecting that decision not to pursue the Block 2 procurement strategy? And the third question has to do with sort of supply chain issues. I'm a supply chain person and an entrepreneur myself. And when you make decisions like this decision to no longer fund the Block 2 upgrades, you've made decisions down the chain, the supply chain as well. Do you anticipate that there will be any supply chain implications, small businesses or suppliers going out of business? And what would be the plan if that were the case to make sure that you could sustain the existing fleet?
Yes, Congresswoman, and in fact, we just met with Boeing on that very same issue. I'm very concerned about the organic industrial base, the ability to maintain that capability. What the Army right now is committed to doing is we are buying CH-47 Foxes and Block 2s for our special operations regiment. So that's going to start, they will be converted to Golfs. And the other thing we're working with, and this gets back to my earlier answer about foreign military sales, we are working with our partners. We think the CH-47 Foxtrot is a great aircraft. The Secretary and the Chief had to make some tough decisions as far as modernization. We want to produce the future attack reconnaissance aircraft along with the future long-range assault aircraft, which Boeing is competing for. And what we want to do is keep the line going for the next couple of years, and then we'll be in a position to make a decision on how we either do we recap Block 1s and Block 2s, do we sustain them, or do we come up with a new way of doing that mission in the future.
And what do you think, if any, the implications of that decision are for downstream suppliers?
Well, I would hope that they look at that's the future. I mean, what we're doing right now is we're kind of in the place of where we were in the 1970s coming out of Vietnam, and we had a thing called the Big Five where we came up with the Abrams tank, the Bradley, the Apache helicopter, the Black Hawk, and the Patriot. We see the same thing right now. So what we're recommending to industry is listen to what we're saying, produce these aircrafts, compete for these new systems that are coming in place. And that's what's going to drive the subs and everything else for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years.
Thank you. I certainly hope so. With the remainder of my time, this question is for anyone who'd like to weigh in. On April the 26th of this year, the CMO of the DoD published a report on the reforming of the business operations of DoD. And in the report, it specifically addressed our need to reduce delays in recruiting of civilians, which can result in managers substituting more expensive military or contractor personnel in place of less costly contractors. In addition to that budget effect of this substitution, what happens when a military service member who is working outside of their specialty for which they were trained and are performing a civilian job function? And what are the effects of this substitution on the force as it relates to retention? This question is for any of you.
Congresswoman, let me jump in on that. Getting the right force and getting them onboarded fast is one of those things that we've got to compete and win for. If we compete we can't compete on money. We're competing on mission and talent. So we have to have a way to bring people on board fast, and not doing so just hurts us in the long run. Once we get them on board, if we get them the right clearances and things, we find that they are really empowered. They like what they're doing. They're doing things that they can't do anywhere else, specifically in the cyber workforce. So we have to be able to continue to do that. And I would also ask that we look for how do we make it permeable so in the future, the basic questions we ask them, do you want to be full-time or part-time? Do you want to be in uniform or civilian? And find a way that people can work in the government, maybe go back to industry, spend time in industry, and then decide, you know what, I liked what I was doing back in government, and be able to come back in quickly and easily with a security clearance. And I think that would be very helpful moving forward.
I would love it if we might be able to get some information or data from you guys later on about how frequently this is occurring where we are substituting military personnel in for civilian jobs. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Houlihan. Mr. Brooks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General McConville, in your written testimony, you mentioned the, quote, recent surge in enemy ballistic missile, hypersonic cruise missile, and unmanned aircraft capabilities, end quote. How will efforts that increase the ability of systems to communicate with each other, such as the Integrated Air and Missile Defense Battle Command System, address this changing threat environment and improve Army readiness?
Yes, Congressman. I think, as we move into great power competition where we will be contested in every single domain, and by domain, I mean on the land, in the sea, in the air, in space, in cyber, we must have systems, and IBCS, we're looking forward to getting that in the hands of our soldiers, because what that's going to do is it's going to tie together different shooters that can actually take those missiles or air systems down that are protecting our soldiers with the sensors. So we're looking forward to getting that into the hands of our soldiers and moving ahead on that system.
Thank you. In the time that remains, Admiral Moran, General Thomas, and General Wilson, clearly increasing interoperability and communication between sensor platforms such as radars, fires, and command and control is not a challenge for the Army alone. Will each of you please speak to the efforts your organizations are making to meet this challenge? And we'll start with Admiral Moran and work our way across.
Congressman, thanks for the question. I think we, the four of us talk about this all the time. We've got our folks working at multiple levels in each of our organizations collaboratively together to solve this. None of us want to spend money on something somebody else is already fixing. So it's to our benefit to collaborate with our sister services to make sure that we're taking full advantage. We know we're going to fight in the future just like we are today as a joint force. And in the environment you just described, speed is important, speed of decision, speed of orientation, all important, and we're going to have to do this together. So we've got to be able to put a system together that can talk to each other without interruption.
General Thomas?
Congressman, a key aspect of this, discussion is standards and making sure that those standards are agreed upon across all the services. We think that we're making significant progress in those areas. And then when you enter the acquisition process, you know that whatever you're building is not a stovepipe. I don't want to be Pollyannish. I think there's a long way to go. But I think in terms of the discussions across the services, it's also, I think we've made progress in that area. And the last thing I would say is, this is a key aspect of our ConOps in a great power competition. So this is something that we have to get correct.
General Wilson?
All my battle buddies here and I talk about this all the time too. It's something that's vitally important in the future because this is what's going to win any future fight. It's beyond the technology and the warfighting concept. It has to connect in the command and control. So any platform, any sensor, we have to be able to connect, share, and learn. And so we're working that. All the service secretaries have signed memos that said anything we build new has to be to the same standard. We've got teams working together. For example, we'll have a partnership to stop talking about this and admiring the problem and make it real, going out to Nellis Air Force Base, to the Shadow Ops Center, to bring together a team with the right developers, with the right joint teammates, with DARPA, with industry, to be able to get after this problem, because this is our asymmetric advantage. This will be the thing that makes the United States win in the future.
Generals, Admiral, thank you for your service. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks. We now turn to Ms. Escobar.
Thank you, Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you so much, not just for your testimony today, but for your service. I'm very, very grateful. I represent El Paso, Texas, home of Fort Bliss and the Texas 16th Congressional District. So I'd like to ask you about something that's a priority for my district, and this question goes to General McConville. As you know, Fort Bliss makes a major contribution to readiness as one of just 2 active mobilization force generation installations for the Army. We support key mobilization capabilities for regular and contingency operations, for units and individuals, and we're the only installation conducting the CONUS Replacement Center mission, which supports missions across 5 continents. Fort Bliss leadership has identified rail yard improvements as a key readiness initiative and a necessary upgrade to support the MFGI mission. I was very disappointed to see that it didn't make the cut in the fiscal year 2020 budget. As we look ahead and considering the importance of being able to rapidly mobilize personnel and equipment when pre-positioned stock are not available, it's clear we need to invest today to be ready for the conflicts of tomorrow, something you all have been saying over and over again. What risks do we take by not beginning this work in fiscal year 20? When can we expect to see progress on this critical project, do you think?
Yes, Congressman, and you know, the point you make about the importance of rail yards and the ability to get critical equipment to the ports is the way we pretty much deploy in the United States Army, especially with an organization that has those critical capabilities. And not having, you know, a modernized rail yard slows down the deployment capability. They certainly have the, you know, that's not stopping them from deploying, but they certainly can do it better. You know, for us, it's a matter of priorities. We have to take a look at all the priorities that come in. We have other places and other forts that have the same concerns, and we go through a process to take a look at what organization needs it the most at the time, giving the funds that we got, and we make that decision. So that will be in the decision-making process. We will take a hard look at that and provide you some feedback over the next year.
I appreciate that. Between training and mobilization, Fort Bliss interacts with units from every single U.S. state and territory, as you know. So
it's a wonderful place.
It is. It's fantastic. So to my next question to General Wilson and General Thomas, this is about resiliency. I know that many of my colleagues on this committee are closely tracking repairs and recovery at Tyndall Air Force Base and Camp Lejeune. I mean, I know that that is a key priority for all of us. We stand with you. You have our support. But I want to know going forward, because I am very, very concerned about what I believe is an existential crisis with climate change. How can we best plan proactively to protect our military personnel and resources from the challenges that come from climate change? Is resilience planning required, and standardization, should that be required as well across all installations? Would love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, Congresswoman, there is no safe place for weather. If we look at this last year, we had earthquakes, we had forest fires, we had tornadoes, we had flooding, we had hurricanes. We have to plan for resilience at our bases. Our bases are a warfighting power projection platform. And so we need to look at the requirements. We need to make sure we got resiliency built in. And we also have to, as we use Tyndall as an example, use that as an opportunity to design the base of the future with the right infrastructure and the right resiliency built into it. And we need to do that broadly across all of our bases and infrastructure.
Congresswoman, one of the things that we've seen as we've kind of gone through this last several months is just the importance of making sure that our buildings are up to modern code. What we saw again in the 800 buildings that were damaged at Camp Lejeune, the newer buildings that were up to code did pretty well. It's the older buildings that suffered the most damage, and so that's a key aspect of it. I think also within the footprint of the base itself, we've got to look at where we're placing new buildings, if water levels at a certain area, to mitigate that. And then, at a strategic look, we look across, all of our bases across the entire portfolio and making sure that we're postured for the next 50 years. And so that's a discussion that's ongoing as well.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Escobar. Gentlemen, I will come back to this issue in the second round of questions. I now turn to Mr. Bergman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations, General McConville and Admiral Moran. Looks like within the next few months we're going to have 3 new heads of services with General Berger coming in as the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and I guess within a year after that, the Air Force will have a new Chief of Staff as well. So literally within the next 12 to 14 months, 4 new heads of services. Like anything, when you're coming in, I'm telling you what you already know. When you come in as the new chief, you get to make your mark. That's the way it works historically. You all have done great. We talk about readiness, unit readiness, equipment readiness, personnel readiness, family readiness. Some things are finite, time and money, okay? And the point is, I'd like you all to take this for the record, not to be answered now, because as we in our committee sit here and try to figure out and decipher the budgets, you know, the programs that you send to us, it is important to see where we need to fund warfighting readiness at all levels. The challenge that we all have as organizations is, where do we stop putting O&M dollars into areas that either are legacy, but probably more important, bureaucratic processes. Anybody remember dimers? Okay. We can all smile at that, because the point is, as we look at the technological side of how you are going to run your service, we have an opportunity here under your command, I believe, to make the bureaucratic administrative changes necessary that's going to allow us to leverage those finite dollars, so then you can have more money to put where you know you need it. Okay, and this is a little bit of a challenge, but it is an opportunity, I think, that we have right now to do this. Because what that does, let's face it, what's our goal in warfighting? Well, it's to win, but the ideal goal is to make sure our potential adversaries don't engage us in the first place, because they know they're going to lose. And for us to be able to show that we're looking at how we fight our wars from a 360-degree perspective, and that is taking those dollars that maybe went down an administrative hole and we put them into ammunition, that sends a real strong signal as to how we're moving forward. So I guess I would just say we will be your partners. You know, one of the leadership of the subcommittee here in Readiness is how we evaluate that, but I believe we're going to have an opportunity here to move forward on showing where we can, again, decrease some of the spending. And it's not necessarily wasteful, it's just kind of unintended consequences, because we've been doing it this way for so long. So I guess this is more of a statement than asking questions, but I would, if you could, for the record, sometime in the next month or so, give this committee an example of where you did it jointly or within your service of cutting some behind the times bureaucratic administrative costs. So you said, no, we looked at this and we said, nope, we're not going to spend money on this before. This would, I believe, be helpful for the committee. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bergman. A very good question, and we'll expect to get that answer and certainly pass it around to the members of the committee. Ms. Holland, I notice you're here. You returned. Thank you. Your turn.
Thank you very much, Chairman. My first question is for General Wilson, and I just wanted to follow up on a question that my colleague, Ms. Torres Small, asked earlier. And so it's, are there opportunities within the existing budget request to achieve this capstone principle of allocating at least one unit-equipped wing and flying squadron in each of the 54?
Congressman, we will certainly look into what is in the art of the possible, working with New Mexico moving forward.
Thank you so much. And my next question, I think like each one of you can answer this. It has to do with energy resiliency and renewables. The Defense Science Board Task Force on Survivable Logistics made recommendations on the urgent need to modernize our military's joint logistics enterprise. They recommended that the military departments focus RDT&E funds on fuel demand reduction, local generation of electricity, increasing battery storage and decreasing battery weight, and to establish a logistics RDT&E board to synchronize RDT&E investments in these spaces. Do you plan to implement this recommendation? And would the services benefit from more coordination across the services? And we can start and go down the line.
Yes, Congresswoman, we understand the importance of energy conservation. You mentioned batteries, and I need to go out to Fort Carson, Colorado, which I did not know until I started taking a look at this, but we have supposedly the biggest battery in the federal service, and there's a huge battery that we're using out there that's helping us give energy resilience. It's also helping us work with the private company out there to reduce the spikes in energy. So we're getting resilience, and we're also getting some savings, and we're also helping them out as far as spikes go. So we're looking for those type things along with what everyone else is doing to get more energy efficient buildings that are resilient and also save energy. And just one final idea is, as we build new systems, we're doing an improved turbine engine program, and we're getting efficiency to that. We're getting a lot better horsepower out of the engines, but we're also getting better utilization of energy to power those engines.
Thank you.
I would say the same for the Navy in terms of infrastructure. As we put new buildings out, we replace housing units. There's a lot of opportunity there in the energy savings. But on a broader operational front, I would say that for the Navy, we have a great interest in trying to be energy efficient so that we have to refuel less, whether we're talking about aircraft or we're talking about ships. So looking at hybrid electric, integrated electric drives that don't rely as much on fuel, especially when we're in places where we don't have to move at high speed.
Excellent.
Congresswoman, I would, like my colleagues, emphasize the importance of when we're looking at infrastructure across our bases, anytime we're building something new, there's tremendous opportunity to employ energy efficiency technologies, and we are seeing that across all of our bases. But there's the operational aspect as well. Admiral Moran talked about from a Navy perspective, from a Marine perspective, you talk about fuel, that's weight. So we're looking for opportunities to have to carry less stuff. And so to the extent that we can operationalize that, that is what we're trying to do. And we've actually been doing that over the past with our joint teammates. We have an expeditionary energy office that looks at things of that nature, and we have had some success over the past 15 years in Iraq and Afghanistan employing those technologies.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, I'd say it's much the same for all the infrastructure. We're also working on those things that they've talked about, whether it be adaptive engines to give us better fuel efficiency, whether it be wingtips, winglets on the engines or the wings of the airplane to give us some, or on the fuselage. We're looking at software that helps us predict and plan our routes to be more fuel efficient. So we're looking across the gamut. We know how important energy is to all of us, and we're trying to find all those savings that we can.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Chairman, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. I now turn to Ms. Horn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. General Wilson, I want to start with you. I represent Oklahoma's 5th Congressional District, which, as I'm sure you know, is adjacent to Tinker Air Force Base. And when we're talking readiness, we can't do so really without talking about the critical piece that our depots play. And as Tinker works with aging airframes from the KC-135, the B-1, the B-52, and many other critical components, it's also an economic engine as well as a support to our forces across the Air Force and their readiness. So I want to ask you about issues surrounding the overall facilities. There was a GAO report about military depots and actions needed, entitled Military Depots, Actions Needed to Improve Poor Conditions of Facilities and Equipment that Affect Maintenance, Timeliness, and Efficiency. And in that report, it specifically mentioned the repair of equipment at Tinker being poor and exceeding its useful life. So with that in mind, what is the Air Force doing specifically to address this problem in both the short and the long term? And what is the strategy for addressing the what it estimates is $104 million backlog restoration at Tinker?
Yeah, Congresswoman, you're correct in that our depots are critical to our warfighting capability moving forward, specifically Tinker. I would say we work closely with the GAO and we agree with lots of things. Let me maybe nuance the part. Certainly the facilities are important and we have work to do to improve those. But besides the facilities, it's also the people that work there, the equipment there. And in our case, we're dealing with airplanes that are often way past their design life. So when I bring in a KC-135 that's, over 50 years old, we're finding things that we've never found before. So it's important that we have all those pieces, not only from the facilities, but the people, the equipment, and then we're looking at all the processes we can to speed up the depot throughput. We think we've seen some improvements to that. That we've done some blue soup maintenance and some work with our processes, and we've done it now 30% faster than we've done it under the contractors before. But it's an ecosystem that supports the depots. Again, it is the facilities, but beyond the facilities, it's the people, the equipment, the parts, and the processes that support it.
Absolutely, and the chairman and ranking member visited me at Tinker, and we toured the facilities, and they're absolutely, to their credit, doing amazing work at Tinker, both the civilians as well as our uniformed service members, and the efficiencies that they've been able to put into place in the maintenance of these KC-135s and other aircraft are really phenomenal. And I think it's important to note that they have increased the speed of the turnover by 40% at half the cost of recent industry contract proposals. So that's really important. But I also want to visit a question that some of my colleagues have touched on about the industrial base, because one of the challenges that Tinker and I'm sure other depots are facing right now with the maintenance of aircraft that are 60 plus years old, they're finding things that are breaking, as you said, in new ways. And the inability of, or sometimes the absence of, OEMs and the parts, the work that's being done there at the Rapid Sustainment Office to fill those gaps is really critical. So next step is, my question is, what additionally is the Air Force doing to encourage the industrial base and the small or smaller contractors to fill these holes?
Yeah, it's a great input. We just met, as an example, in New York City with small businesses, and in one day awarded 51 contracts to small businesses where they came in, they gave a pitch, they had a one-page contract, and they were on business with the United States Air Force. We're trying to knock down all the barriers to doing business with small business, which is all across of our country. As a tagline that I thought was fantastic, one of the small businesses says, it's easier and faster to do business with the United States Air Force than it is to get a beer in New York City, right? That's a good testament to what we're trying to do as we build and modernize the force faster and smarter. And we realize that all of our, that it's vitally important to our nation to have this industrial capability, and we're going to need all hands on deck to be able to do that.
Thank you. Yield back the balance of my time.
We're going to do a second round, so if you got to go, you got to go, but you can have another shot. I want to thank our members for raising a whole series of really critical issues. And each time they spoke, I started adding to my list. So we're good for about another 3 hours. Can you gentlemen stay with us? With regard to the question of the industrial supply base, last year in our wisdom, we created a program called, it was Section 846 of the 2019 NDAA. It's called the Defense Manufacturing Community Support Program. I'm sure you four gentlemen are very much aware of this. I became aware of it about an hour and a half ago. Not that I had read every line of last year's NDAA. It has not been funded. It's an appropriation that's specifically designed to address the problem that we saw at Tinker. That is the major contractors have given up providing the parts necessary for the 135 and other legacy platforms. This may be a solution in bringing into the industrial supply base new manufacturers, small manufacturers, and the like. We're looking at trying to put $50 million into the appropriation bill to fund this program so these gentlemen and their services can make use of this outreach that occurs. It also is tied into a tax bill that provides certain tax credits for certain parts of America that are in economic distress. So I will leave that one to you. Here's a note for you, and for you gentlemen, we'll get the same thing. The other thing has to do with the issues that were raised by my colleagues here. The energy issue, it's in the law. It's been there for, I think, about 5 years now. This committee will press you hard on that, looking for resiliency on the base energy resiliency, and energy reduction. We don't need to talk about climate change. We need to talk about energy reduction, cost savings, and the like. All of you talked about some of the things that you're doing good. You might consider some of those gas guzzlers that run around on your bases. They could be electric cars. Many, many things, energy conservation, all of that. That ties back to what I've shared with everybody that cared to listen, and that is that the building codes going forward are going to be, we're going to try to make them the strictest in the nation with regard to sustainability, wind, earthquake, fire, and energy conservation. So be aware of that. In this year's NDAA and appropriations, previous years' military construction programs are going to be funded. We believe that many of those are not built to the highest standard or to modern today's standards. They're designed for yesterday's standard. I would ask each of the services to look at those specific programs and military construction programs. And in the normal process of design change and construction changes that occur, it may be appropriate and possible to improve the energy resilience, conservation, wind, and so forth with very little additional cost, if any. It might just be a simple additional screw that's put into the rafter. So if you'll take a look at that, keep that in mind. We don't want to change the design plan, but I've been through enough construction over the years to know that there's never been a construction project that didn't have changes along the way. And so keep that in mind. And we will help you by providing some language in the NDAA so that you're reminded. With regard to Camp Lejeune and Cherry Point, as well as Tyndall and Offutt, I shared this with the services. Your plans must be presented to us on how you're going to address the risk at that base. It may be flooding. We've talked about this at Camp Lejeune and Cherry. We didn't pick up, and you didn't mention Paris Island. We have had that discussion. With regard to Tyndall, you've given us a preliminary report on what might be there. I looked at it, and it looked to me like you're building right back where you were. I hope that is not the case. It appears that a good many of the buildings at Tyndall are on the beachfront, or at least the front of the waterway there. Storm surge is going to happen, another Category 5. There may have been 5 in the last century. There's certainly going to be 5 in the next. They're going to be Category 5 hurricanes in that area. And I want to, as you said, but did not put in your plan, General Wilson, at least what you've given to us, the relocation of facilities away from the most harmful and most likely area to be harmed. We're going to look at that very carefully. We're going to scrub it. You're going to scrub it first. We'll look at it. If you go back and build where it was destroyed, you better be able to tell us there's absolutely no other place. And then you better build it for the worst possible case. Similarly, and for the rest of you, one of our colleagues talks about base access roads. I suggested maybe waders would suffice at Norfolk, and we can save some money. Admiral Moran, you've got a problem. You know it. Not only there, but other places, sea level rise is real. And the Army, we can probably find some place where you've got a similar problem. So please keep in mind that this committee is going to want to build for the next 70 years. And we're going to assume the worst possible thing to happen. Don't want to pick on the Marines, but there's going to be a fire at Pendleton, and it right now could probably take out your housing program, too, and probably some other things. I'm sure the rest of you have similar circumstances. So that's heads up. We're going to watch it closely. We'll put language in to encourage you to do it, and we'll follow along on that. One final point, and that is my current thing that just wakes me up. It doesn't wake me up. It doesn't put me to sleep either, but during the day I ponder. There was $1 billion of unused money in the Department of Defense 2 months ago. It was in the Army personnel account. For whatever reasons, you didn't meet your recruiting, didn't spend the money, it was sitting there $1 billion. By most accounts, it was somewhere $1,150 million of immediate expense to just clean up Cherry Point, Lejeune, and Tyndall. That $1 billion was used to build a fence on the border, not for the needs of the military, even though the money was already in the military. I know how it was done. Transferred the money over to a counter-narcotics program, which has the authority to build facilities to stop narcotics. That is a game that made this chairman very, very angry. Now, your job is to take an order and salute and get it done. It's not you. This is a message for the service secretaries that didn't say one word of opposition. When you, General Wilson, and the Air Force were in desperate need of money to clean up a terrible disaster that happened at your bases. And the same for you, General Thomas. So we're short of $1 billion. Presumably we'll have a fence someplace. The question for this nation is that fence more important than Tyndall Air Force Base getting back under operation and Camp Lejeune and Cherry Point? I don't expect you gentlemen to answer, but I want that message to be on everybody's mind, because the next brick is going to fall, and it's going to fall this Friday by all accounts. And that is the existing military construction budget that may be whacked for $4 billion of programs that are thought by every one of your services to be the highest priority. They've been scrubbed and reviewed by not only your services, but by the Appropriations Committee in both houses and the authorizing committees in both houses, and found to be necessary. About $4 billion of projects may be taken out of your services. We'll be expected to backfill it. And where the money's going to come from isn't known yet. But there's a limit to the amount of money that's available. And it's going to come from something in the Department of Defense. So maybe it'll come from, I don't know, fuel for your airplanes. I don't know. So we got to be aware of what's going on here. And this is a very serious problem for the nation's defense. And I don't know when you're going to get, General Wilson, when you're going to get a emergency appropriation bill. It's locked up in the Senate. As I said earlier, we're going to try to push something again through this House. Maybe get things moving, maybe not. But you just said it's a critical problem for the readiness of the U.S. Air Force, and I'm sure it is for the Marines also. There are consequences to stupid decisions that have been made. And the consequence here is the nation's security. So just be aware that as chairman of this committee, I'm watching this closely. I'm very, very concerned about what the long-term and short-term readiness implications will be. I don't know if I asked you guys a question. I guess I made some comments. But be aware that on all of these matters, we'll be paying very, very close attention to it. Mr. Lamborn, if you have another question, it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you. I do have a couple of specific questions. Although, let me, in response to what you just elaborated on, I want to say that there is another side of the story. Many of us do feel that the situation at the southern border is also a national security issue. It's Homeland Security, not DOD. However, it is a very important issue. I would not use the word stupid myself. I would say that there are well-considered arguments actually in favor of beefing up the southern border, but we're not going to get into that here. What I would like to get into here, though, I have a couple of specific questions, but before I ask those easy, specific questions, could you all talk about pre-positioned stocks? How is the stockpile that you're concerned about, and what does Congress need to do to make sure that that is at 100%?
Congress, I'll go ahead and start. And first of all, pre-positioned stocks are absolutely critical for the United States Army. You know, we have a concept of dynamic force employment, which allows us to quickly move forces around the globe. And by having those pre-positioned stocks, we can quickly fall on equipment. But if the equipment is not ready to go, if the ammunition is not there, if all the logistics are not there, it really doesn't accomplish the mission that we want to do it. The funding we've had over the last 2 years has really significantly improved that. We've put significant amounts into all our pre-positioned stocks, and we are at a much higher rate of readiness because of that.
Congressman, same for the Navy. We are taking a hard look at our logistics network to include Prepo. It is old. It needs replacement, and we're working on some. We are working on some opportunities to change that. Working with this body, Congress, to help us have the authorities to do what we need to get a more modern force that can resupply the force.
Okay.
Congressman, we're very grateful for the support that we've gotten from Congress to help us get our pre-positioned stocks where they need to be from a Marine Corps perspective, places like Norway, and then munitions as a part of the Department of the Navy. As we look forward and you know, posture going forward for the joint force, you know, I think that pre-positioned stocks is going to only become more important.
But do you feel that the Marine pre-positioned stocks are up to snuff?
They are right now, yes.
Congressman, it's the same thing for the Air Force. We've appreciate Congress's support to give us the funding to be able to do that, to be able to support pre-positioned both in Europe and the Pacific. We've increased our stocks across the board, and including munitions.
All right. Okay, thank you. General McConville, can you tell me about synthetic training environment? That's something I don't really know a lot about, I'll admit, and I'd like to know more about it.
Yes, Congressman. We are really excited about the synthetic training environment. I would equate it to virtual reality training. And in fact, we're putting a system in place with kind of the integrated visual augmentation system. What it's going to allow our soldiers to do is to go into virtual reality and train on a mission that they're about ready to accomplish. And what that allows them to do is do 30, 40 repetitions of that actual mission, and it's virtual, it's real. And they can practice, they can rehearse, they can hit the sled a whole bunch of times, and then they can actually take the same equipment we're developing and go and execute the mission.
And they can be scored. Well, you and I are going to have to go through that, experience that firsthand.
No, we do. This is cutting-edge technology. It is going to transform the way we train soldiers and the way soldiers operate in combat. We're excited about it.
Well, I'm excited too.
Congressman, I'll jump onto that because we're using the same thing, for example, in pilot training next, where we're using today's state-of-the-art technology, and we're finding we can produce pilots quicker and actually better. We've had our first couple classes underway, and the results are astounding.
How is it different than the old simulator approach to training?
Well, it actually takes it to the next level. So if you were to go to, we've got one in Austin to be able to do this. You put on virtual reality goggles. It's basically looking at your eye movement. You're able to do multiple repetitions. It's not expensive to do this. And again, students can go through hundreds of reps where before they couldn't do that. Okay. And so it's really reducing the amount of time it takes to train folks.
Critical. Yeah, Admiral, did you want to add?
I'll just piggyback on what General Wilson just commented on. The Navy is, any Air Force and Marine Corps, shifted heavily towards what we call live virtual constructive. So we can take and this is an energy savings step that's really important to understand. So in the old days, not too long ago, you used to actually have to fly red air to present enemy forces to a live event with your own Blue Air Force. Nowadays, you can inject that virtually through the system. It'll show up on the radar. It'll show up on on the heads-up display in cockpits, on ships, and in other areas as if it were real. So you're saving all that money by not having to generate other red air or red surface submarine forces, red missiles that are coming at you. That can all be done through a live virtual constructive environment. It's really beneficial to training because you can do more reps and sets than you could if you had to put airplanes up or shoot live weapons.
Well, it sounds, Mr. Chairman, like that's going to take readiness to the next level. So that's really exciting.
It will if the simulators are paid for and available on time. And I understand, I'm trying to remember which of the four forces has a problem with the more advanced simulator and it's been delayed a bit. I think it might be a ship simulator.
No, sir. If the budget goes through, we are appropriately funded to deliver those on time.
Not fair to toss the ball back here. Not fair. Mr. Wilson, you had a question. Let me get out of this.
And thank you very much, Chairman Garamendi. And as a member of Congress, as a veteran, but mostly as a military dad of 4 sons who've served in the branches, it's just so reassuring to have such leadership on behalf of our country. Thank you for what you mean to the people of the United States and promoting freedom around the world. And General McConville, I'm grateful that the Army's efforts over the last 2 years to address the decline of readiness. The Army's goal is for 66% of the active duty forces as rated to meet full spectrum readiness requirements by fiscal year 2022. As the current Vice Chief of Staff and future Chief of Staff, do you think the Army can achieve the goal of 66% by 2022? What are the challenges and obstacles that might prevent you from attaining the goal? Is 66% enough to meet the goals of the National Defense Strategy, and does the budget align with that goal?
Congressman, first of all, we believe we'll make it, and again, I don't want to push it back to you, but the timely, adequate, predictable, and sustainable funding is going to allow us to do that. We have a positive path right now. We've seen what's happened over the last 2 years, and we are convinced if we get the resources that we can get to that level, and then we believe that level is going to be sufficient for the threats we're going to face.
Well, again, we just appreciate your determination and best wishes on your future position, too. And additionally, General, the Army's operation and maintenance account request includes an additional $132.5 million for maneuver unit accounts. These accounts support training and operations for the Army's brigade combat teams to maintain readiness. How does the budget request impact the number of combat training center rotations for the Army's brigade combat teams? How are the combat training centers developing the environment to support the multi-domain operations?
Yes, Congress. First of all, the funding gives us 32 rotations. 25 of those combat training center are what we call decisive action type rotations. And what we'll do is we'll immerse our soldiers into situations where they are basically contested in most of the domains they're going to see in the battlefield. So it's just not the ground. They're going to have electronic warfare challenges. They're going to have cyber warfare challenges. They're going to have space challenges as they execute their operations. And so as we train our forces for the future, we're not trying to fight the last fight better. We're trying to win the next fight.
Thank you very much, General. And Admiral, with the multiple collisions, sadly, that we've had in the past several years, what is, in your testimony, you indicate that there's been a budget assignment of the highest priority of recommendations to the Comprehensive Review and Strategic Readiness Review. What is this budget that directly addresses the readiness shortfalls in training, maintenance, and operations to prevent future collisions?
Sir, in the fiscal year, we've already invested close to $100 million in the last year and a half since the collisions. We've got $348 million in fiscal year 20 and over $1 billion across the FIDIP to do all of the things that support every single recommendation in the comprehensive review and the SRR.
And thank you again for your determination to address this on behalf of the health and safety of our naval personnel. And General Wilson, the former Secretary of Defense James Mattis directed the Air Force to achieve 80% mission capability by the end of fiscal year 2019 for combat-coded strike aircraft. Will the Air Force meet this goal for F-15, F-22, and F-35 A, how does the budget enable the Air Force to meet these readiness goals?
Congressman, I'm confident we're going to make it on the F-16. We've put a lot of money into the parts to be able to improve our MC rates, and we've seen an improvement across the F-16 fleet. For the F-22 fleet, I'm not as confident, and that's because of the impact of Hurricane Michael. We had to dislocate all the families and are now just showing up at the new bases, as well as the critical driver for the F-22 is our LO maintenance. And we had to shut down our LO maintenance facility at Tyndall for about 6 months. It's now back up and running, but I'm not confident we're going to make it for the F-22. For the F-35, all of us, the Navy, Marine Corps, and the Air Force are working hard to make sure we've got the right parts in the system to be able to try to achieve that 80% MC rate.
And as I conclude, General Thomas, we're really grateful for the F-35s located at Beaufort Marine Corps Air Station. It's such a positive enhancement to that very significant military facility. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Wilson, thank you for raising the F-35. This committee is going to spend a lot of time on the F-35. The issues we decided to put them aside today because it demands at least one full hearing, if not multiple hearings, to deal with all of the issues in the F-35. We will get to that. One of the things that was raised here early on, I think it came out from Ms. Horn with regard to Tinker. The reality is that the services are dependent upon civilian personnel. The training, the ability to hire civilian personnel. I know, Admiral Moran, you've hired several, 20-some thousand at the various shipyards, if I recall the numbers, somewhere in that range. There's an important piece of it. There are hiring issues. There are training issues. We want to go into those. We'll go into those in depth with at a later not a hearing, but probably briefing. Would welcome the participation of certainly the staff and the members as we get into the civilian personnel issues and the training issues. Just going through my notes. I don't want you gentlemen to escape without the final word here. Finished? With that, gentlemen, thank you very much. Congratulations once again, General McConville, Admiral Moran, thank you, and we will look forward to our next iteration in the readiness of the services. Thank you very much. The hearing is adjourned.